record. Okay, I think we can start. I mean, not many people here today, but let's see. Hi everyone, it's 21st August today. This is the Cluster API Office Hours meeting. Before we start, just want to note, we're following the code of conduct from the CNCF, so please be nice to each other, and yeah, use raise hands feature to notify that you have something to say. Proposal readout. I think we can skip over this today. We did last week, and we, I think, talked about it 2 weeks ago or something like that. There's the stock around and a pull request for it too. So if you want to engage, please take a look there. So going down to the agenda. Totally forgot about this point. Yeah, if we have new attendees, feel free to speak up and say hi. I will just let it slip for some seconds.
Hi, I'm a first-time attendee. I'm Sandhya Dasu. I am at Red Hat, and I'm looking forward to contributing more towards CAPI upstream.
Hi, Sandhya. Nice to meet you, and you're very welcome. We always need to have new maintainers stepping up, so good to hear. Someone else?
This is Evan Johnson, also a new first-time attendee. I'm from Akamai Linode, so working on our cluster API provider, looking to sort of get more involved.
Welcome, welcome. Okie doke. With that, we can go over to the discussion topics. There's not much there yet. So before we go to you, Jill, if you have something to speak about, feel free to add it to the agenda. But yeah, I think Jill, take it off.
Cool. Okay, so this topic is about what I think would be a net new and wide-reaching, I guess, method of operating CAPI, especially in the infrastructure cluster realm. So we use Cluster API to spin up OpenShift clusters. And when we do that, currently we throw away the infrastructure cluster object. We don't pivot that into the cluster. There are many reasons for that, but we had some discussions recently about the idea of what if we did pivot the infrastructure cluster into what effectively becomes a management cluster for us in various guises, and concluded that actually we are uncomfortable with a cluster self-managing the infrastructure that it lives in. Various security concerns, you're giving it permission to effectively delete all of the infrastructure it lives on. You could, in theory, for a bug, delete the load balancer that accesses QAPI server, or even the storage or something, right? There's lots of reasons why something going wrong on that cluster could be very detrimental, not only to itself, but then other clusters, if these are management clusters, as mentioned. But it did get us talking. So especially in some of our use cases, it would be really useful to know what the infrastructure should look like, as in, this is what it was set up with, here's the definition, i.e. the infrastructure cluster YAML, and here's what it actually looks like in the real world, and what's the difference. Now, a lot of the infrastructure clusters, I had to scan through the code of a couple, go through and reconcile stuff over time, right? So taking an example of this would be like security group rules in AWS, where it works out what the difference is and then sends an update to add and remove rules. If rather than actually sending that add and remove to AWS, it noted it down in the status, like, here's some drift I detected. This might be why you're experiencing issues in your cluster. We could build tooling on top of the cluster API that would then say, okay, here's some drift. You've got an alert for this cluster that says the cluster's broken for some reason. Maybe we fix the infrastructure drift first and then see if it goes away. So where we start running thousands of these, it would be really helpful to be able to say, we've got tooling now that already understands what the cluster should look like and is telling us this part is broken. How does that sound to people? Has anyone thought about this before? Does it sound useful to others, or is this kind of a you're on your own there, no one else is interested?
That's a pretty tough one. Anyone has some ideas? Yeah, Stefan, go ahead.
Yeah, almost as tough as finding the right button to raise my hand here. So basically, like our team, we don't have that problem anymore because we don't run copy on top of copy anymore. So we don't have self-managed anymore. What I'm mostly wondering is how can we describe a diff in a infrastructure agnostic way that some other tool can parse it, understand it, and then do something about it, right?
Yeah, that's really difficult.
Maybe that's the most tricky part about it. Thinking about CapV specifically, because that's the one info provider I know. Yeah, maybe just one additional angle. So we have like two different modes in CapV. One is basically really also just calling APIs in vSphere. So there's probably a way to say, hey, that's a diff, or that infrastructure cluster controller is not doing that much there. But we also have another mode where basically our infra-cluster controller is just changing CRDs of another controller that is then doing stuff. So probably on top of being able to describe diffs in infrastructure APIs, it's also about describing diffs in other CRDs, maybe if you have infra providers that are just building on top of other controllers which are doing the actual work. Probably not like an additional problem, it's just like one additional variant of that problem. Maybe a more like fundamental question. I mean, how much do we trust cluster API or not, right? Because infrastructure cluster is just one dimension, but it's also doing other stuff like creating and deleting machines. So how much would this go? How much do we allow this to do, or basically nothing? And every single controller that we have would have to be able to describe all the sort of things it's doing. And then basically some other tool is re-implementing all of that stuff, which could be interesting if you're thinking about stuff like, oh, the machine deployment controller is detecting its diff and describing it somewhere. Then you have a controller picking that up and doing changes to machine sets. Then you have a machine set mirror controller, which is picking that up. And so I don't know for which types of resource that's most relevant. I definitely see the point why it's especially relevant for infra-cluster, because if you delete the wrong thing, it's just entirely gone.
Yeah, I think it's more about machines and that kind of something that we accept, right? Like we accept that people can add and delete machines. We expect them not to delete the control plane machines, but giving them that power to then delete, say, the VPC from within the cluster itself is where it then causes an issue, right? I see one of the comments in the chat, if I may go to that. The idea here is that it wouldn't be 1,000 clusters all reporting issues at once, right? Like at the moment, if, let's take a team of SREs and they're looking after 1,000 clusters and one cluster goes weird, something alerts, they've got to go work out what that is. And if it isn't a problem with the infrastructure, because someone's deleted something or whatever, they've got to go and discover that. What we're trying to do here is make it easier for them to discover issues and then go and fix it manually. Whether this is the right way to do it or not, I think is what the discussion here would be.
I think Nolan, you have your hand raised too.
Yeah, Stefan touched on this, but I think doing this in a way that is relatively agnostic will be challenging. Like the other option is expanding the contract with the provider implementations, and that then becomes a place where support could drift, right? So let's say one provider implements it, but nobody else does. So only that one can function in a certain mode. And I think that increases the overall scope of the cluster API, right? It makes the API more complicated. So I think from my perspective, getting it out to the actual infrastructure providers is probably the most challenging point, because it's all fine and good if it you get it working at the cluster API level, but the things that are actually affecting the change are the infrastructure providers. And if you don't have support in both, I don't know what the value of this would be.
So I guess the infrastructure cluster object is the kind of top level infrastructure. There's nothing in core CAPI that brings stuff in from that apart from the load balancer APIs, whatever, load balancer endpoints. So is there anything that would need to aggregate this in a way that is platform agnostic, or would it be down to the providers to say, hey, here's my component, it's called subnets, and I see a drift here because you should have 3 subnets and you've got 2, like you're missing this subnet, and just provide it, I mean, almost in a list, kind of like conditions of this component is not healthy that I own. Is there value in that aside from, like, even without having something that's completely universal? Like, I think that's one issue we've just got to accept within CAPI is we have infrastructure providers, and as much as it is an abstraction, a lot of them just look like the cloud API that they sit in front of. So we haven't done a fantastic job of making them universal and, you know, one API to rule them all. We never will be. It would be a fool's errand. But do we need that for this? I would probably say no.
Yeah, I mostly got to the point because you were saying potentially build some tooling on top that is able to parse that drift and then automatically fix it or something. Yeah, but of course that doesn't have to be like provider independent. It could also very provider specific. Just don't know if you want to standardize the way that we expose the drift in some way.
I feel like we could come up with some guidelines on here's a shape and then implement it within that. But yeah, I mean, I was kind of imagining like within Red Hat, we have teams of SREs that work on specific platforms. So they would only really care about AWS or Azure or whatever it is. There could also be value in individual clusters for end users as well if they have issues. And it's still functioning. I guess that's another issue to consider, is if we build this and the cluster goes wrong, can it even still function to report there's an infrastructure issue?
Yep. And the use case you're coming from is something like, what if a user would basically update the configuration of your AWS cluster or something in an invalid way, and we don't want this to be automatically applied? Or also use case like, oh, what if someone deletes the AWS cluster? Or I mean, we have those discussions frequently with some of our customers. Hey, someone deleted this random machine. You always wonder like how, why, but that doesn't really help in that situation, right? You have to fix them up anyway.
Yeah, to give some concrete examples, it's not infrequent that one of our customers will delete some sort of firewall rule on one of the clusters and then start complaining because new nodes aren't booting. And it's like, well, that firewall rule was key to getting nodes booting up. And it's very hard for us to detect what's going on. All we see is, hey, we can't talk to the ignition server now, like what's going on, and then we have to work it out. But if we had something that would tell us, hey, you know, this firewall rule is missing, that would be a shortcut for us.
So it's not necessarily about something, someone changing something in a management cluster to like update a AWS cluster object. It's probably more around like someone changing something in the actual infrastructure in AWS UI or something, and then detecting a drift between that and what is in cluster API.
Yeah, that's a problem we have a lot.
Okay, got it.
Like we have topologies where we manage OpenShift clusters in someone else's cloud account, and therefore they can go do whatever they like. You know, they might have automation that goes and prunes things, and suddenly the cluster gets, you know, broken because something went missing because it hadn't been updated in so long or whatever it was. So it's kind of about detecting that drift, not someone updating the resources in the cluster.
So is the angle not necessarily preventing like the infra provider controller to break something? It's more like detecting when someone broke something in the infrastructure, right? Because I got it entirely the other way around. Okay.
Yeah, it's identifying someone broke something outside of our cluster. We know what they need to do to put it back because we've got a recommendation from this infrastructure thing that says, hey, you need this rule. You don't have it.
Just one question. Wouldn't usually the AWS cluster controller just fix it up automatically? And what is preventing that to happen?
security concerns.
In the sense of that controller doesn't even have the permissions usually, so there's no way for it to fix it automatically.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to
Okay,
give
yeah, you
those
said it before. Yeah. Okay.
in a lot of these cases. As I'm sure you can imagine, we get lots of customers pushing back. Hey, why have we got this permission? Blah blah blah. You know, we don't want to expand the scope of our permissions that we're giving in these cases.
Okay, next up was Nolan.
So if I understand your point about how this stuff would be reported, Joel, for folks that aren't familiar, OpenShift has a way of aggregating the conditions for cluster operators that are essential for the cluster to function. So they kind of report their own condition and say whether they're ready or operational or progressing towards ready and so forth. So those can be rolled up into an overall cluster readiness check. So if I'm understanding you correctly, Joel, it sounds like what you're proposing is something like these high-level conditions to say, hey, I'm unhealthy, and here's a quick blurb about it. It wouldn't necessarily give a detailed diff. It wouldn't say like, here's the whole, or here's both objects and where they differ. It's, hey, this is the condition and this is the high level thing that we noticed. And that could then be aggregated by some other tooling.
Yeah, I think there's different ways you could expose it. Like log lines are probably going to be the most verbose, and then as you go into an API, something slightly less verbose, and if it gets propagated up at levels. But ultimately, I think for to make this a successful project, what we would want is if someone went and deleted something out of band that's fundamental to the cluster, this thing would flick, and we would see that through our own reporting. Hey, the infrastructure is not happy, and then we can dive into why is the infrastructure not happy and solve that issue first before we go and work out, okay, is there anything else wrong here?
That almost sounds a bit like the deprecated and hopefully not used failure message, failure reason thing we have on resources old. What would make sense maybe is taking a look at Fabrizio's proposal about the conditions and if there's a fit in some conditions there to make this able to get bubbled up if an infra provider detects such a drift.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Fabrizio's proposal. I would say this is orthogonal to be honest. The failure reason and the failure stuff is always been a problem because it was terminal. This is not something that's terminal. It's just a case of, someone's changed this thing, you need to put it back. And when you put it back, I totally agree, conditions are the right way probably to expose this, or some other thing that looks like conditions. But yeah, I can't think of a reason that this depends on Fabrizio's proposal.
Absolutely not. Just yeah. Next up was Chris.
Yeah, so I'm a little confused about the layer that this is happening at, because it sounds like you're already doing error detection on your infrastructure workload clusters and telling people if things are broken there, right?
No, we don't.
No,
have
you're
that.
not doing that. Okay. I would think that would be first, right?
Yeah, the problem is with the way that OpenShift works, they are kind of one and the same. So we don't have, depending on the topology, it's either we've set the infrastructure up and then we throw away the infrastructure cluster, or customers set the infrastructure up and we've put OpenShift kind of on top of it.
Yeah.
But we don't have anything right now. The majority of our clusters that we would manage from our like managed service offerings, from even customer offerings, would be the case where we currently throw the infrastructure cluster away. We'd love to be able to have that put into not only within our kind of managed services, but within customer clusters as well to kind of detect these issues. But we don't have anything today that detects that kind of issue.
So there's no current detection code anywhere today, but you're just looking for at the cluster cuddle level or the management cluster level, some sort of, I guess, drift reporting controller, and then you could use it for both management and workload clusters?
That would be the theory.
Okay. Because otherwise, I was thinking like this is all infrastructure provider checks, right? So I'm not sure what we need at the CAPI level, but if you need it for both, then yeah, I guess that makes sense. Thanks.
I should unmute. Mohammed, you have your hands raised.
Hey, so I can see actually a useful use case for this for orchestration. So for any orchestrator, when we like most of orchestrator I'm working with, when we like trying to orchestrate the clusters, we don't really having like the cluster provider, the infra cluster might be not really aware of it. The orchestrator might not be aware of the provider cluster. So having the cluster exposing this information, it will help for the orchestration. Like for example, in open cluster management, as an orchestrator, we're trying to provision different CABI providers using AWS, Azure, whenever extra. So having exposing this information to the cluster CABI level, it will be helpful to make the orchestrator aware of the cluster state instead of relying on the providers to feedback check each provider, because like whenever a provider keep added, you will need to have the status of this providers that tells you the cluster has something wrong, and there's difference from provider to provider. So exposing this to the cluster CABI, there's actually a valid use case for it, but it's how you're gonna do it then maybe is by teaching the CABI cluster that what to look for maybe in the infra cluster, so then it can expose it. I'm just thinking loud, maybe could be one way to do it, but yeah, but it's like it's a valid use case. I can see it.
Daniel?
Thanks. Yeah. I'm still trying to understand, the use case completely, but in this example, where the user deletes a firewall, which breaks provisioning. Let's say this is Kappa, right? The AWS infra provider. It won't necessarily recognize that there's a problem until some provisioning is actually needed, right? Until it starts taking action, makes I guess in this scenario, it makes an API call for which it doesn't even have permission, and at that point, I guess it could report, right, that hey, I needed to provision a machine, so or sorry, I guess in this case, yeah, we're talking about a firewall rule. Maybe if it recognizes that the firewall rule is missing, right, it makes an API call to add the rule, and then the response is that it doesn't have permission, right? Because this is a scenario that we're talking about. And at that point, I guess, yeah, Kappa could say, okay, I tried to do this. It could even probably give some context as to why it needed to do that. But then I think it would be up to the user to distinguish, right, the sort of the error. Is it an expected error? Like the API said that no, you don't have permissions to do this, and then you recognize that as a sort of a signal that something needs to be fixed, and then somebody else, I guess, goes and fixes this. Is this the way that you imagine this working, Joel?
Yeah, kind of. The point about controllers don't watch cloud resources, right? So they're going to sync periodically. We can, in theory, force that sync period to be whatever we want it to be. We could say every 10 minutes, go and do your checks and check that the infrastructure is as you expect it to be. So we don't necessarily need to wait for a machine event. But yeah, I'd kind of imagined that we would have some sort of flag that says, hey, you're in read-only mode. So anywhere where you would do a write operation to the cloud, write it to the status, don't write it to the cloud. So that then there'd be some sort of way of, a switch there of, yeah, this is, we know we're not giving you permissions that you want, but you can still do all your calculations and you can still work out any diffs. And if you think something needs to be updated, tell me you think it needs to be updated, because then I can go and see, okay, what's the discrepancy, and I can kind of act on that. The recognizing permissions issues and then reporting it is an interesting way of doing it. I wonder if that's just a gap that we have today. I don't know what a CAPI infrastructure cluster controller would do if I didn't give it right permissions, but I bet it's probably going to just hot loop and end up in a crash loop back off kind of thing. Maybe improving that so it says, oh, this is a 403. I shouldn't retry this. It is maybe a first step here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to. I understand what you mean about the read, sort of the read-only mode. I achieving that does seem, like a feature request in every infra provider. That's why I was sort of trying to think through how this would work without changing an infra provider and simply just removing the right WRITE. So the ability for the controller, or sorry, for the infra provider to actually make changes via the infra API and then sort of collect the errors. But that might not work either.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm under no illusion that this isn't a massive new feature here. And it would be a long-term effort if it's something we want to support. But I thought it was kind of an interesting idea, and it would be genuinely like quite a big game changer for our SRE teams. So they asked me to have this discussion. Yeah.
Another angle which could be metrics, like to have metrics and monitoring from the infra provider, but that's also special to an infra provider, not a standardized solution. Stefan, I think afterwards we should go on.
Yeah, just one sub point essentially. I wonder how much you basically want to report. I mean, ideally you just say, hey, I want like the entire diff in one reconcile, give me everything. But I also don't know how basically orthogonal all those write requests that it would do are from each other, because they might build on top of each other. So basically it could be tricky potentially to go through an entire reconcile, always considering that previous write requests didn't actually work. So it really depends, I think, how independent the sort of stuff is that an AWS cluster controller is doing. But maybe it's good enough to to be able to fix it up in 2 or 3 iterations, and you don't actually have to get to like the entire diff in one reconcile.
Yeah, I wonder if this needs a little bit of a spike on it to say, what could we achieve? How could we do this? And then maybe come up with a document that we can all kind of rally around and say, does this make sense, or is this just not going to be achievable?
Yeah, but I mean, in any case, it could be like just a general improvement on, hey, you have a controller running, it is somehow missing permissions. I mean, not in an intentional read-only mode, just better error reporting if someone is missing, giving the correct permissions. So I think there's probably absolutely nothing wrong in that. And then it's probably just a question on how much are we going to standardize this, or make it like a mandatory thing for everyone, or maybe an optional thing with guidelines on how to do it, or.
Yeah, maybe that's the angle here. If we can work to improve the error handling of permissions missing, then maybe we kind of get this for free. I do wonder if I'd get told off for having all of those failed writes in the audit logs, though. I know I would.
There's some more ideas in the chat, like Andreas put up using CubeSat metrics in a condition, probably on the infra cluster to have metrics, or Nolan intercept patch or update requests and report based on them. And I think Nolan is mainly thinks about intercepting the call to the AWS API, for example. Yeah. Also, not easy ones, but yeah. Yeah. Then like the TLDR, this like a dry run mode, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's lots of stuff. Let's maybe move on to the next topic, and I think everyone has the pointer in their head now and thinking about it maybe tonight. Let's see. David.
Yeah, thanks. Just curious, on this managed cluster proposal. I know we merged it, and I know Jack Francis spent some time in my realm working on this, but I'm just curious if there's been any movement or progress from any of the cloud providers or from Cluster API itself, kind of moving towards this consolidated, managed cluster API for CAPI. Or if we're just kind of, or if perhaps everyone's just still sitting on it. It's been a couple of years, I think.
Stefan.
I think not a couple of years, maybe one. I don't know. That's the latest proposal, right, from 2020. So was it the one where we were proposing like making one of
the
cluster or control plane optional, or is it the other one?
Yeah, if you link to the one if you go to the one at the bottom.
Sorry, I was thinking you were talking about the second one, but you were talking about the first one. And then I'll take it back with 1 year.
I thought that was the latest one. There is a link to a feature that's in there. If you go to the history, there's a link to in June of 2023. You link to contract changes to support managed Kubernetes KIP, which is a tangent related one.
Oh, yeah, so this one was updated and managed KRP contract changes was added.
Oh, that's there. Okay. Yeah.
So
that's the one that's at the bottom of the link to that. Yeah. So I guess still the same question remains.
So far so good. The only thing that I'm aware of is that as a core copy maintainer, and I have no idea about info providers in that regard, there were like 2 or 3 PRs from Vince, which basically were, I would say, a first step in the direction of, which way was it? Basically making it possible that control plane providers can provide a control plane endpoint. And I think there was also one which essentially made, hope I'm not getting it the wrong way around, but I think infrastructure cluster optional. And those 2 PRs should have been part of the last release. I think otherwise there was nothing since this proposal merged which did anything in this general area in core copy. I can dig them up from release notes.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's just, it's kind of I think it's a good thing to move towards that trajectory, but obviously it takes different cloud providers to start to, core CAPI changes, which it sounds like there's been a little bit of change there. And then obviously you need providers to start implementing it to do anything with it. But yeah, that helps on the update. Thank you. I think we could probably move to the next one. Cluster class. I noticed there's a lot of issues on cluster class on the repo, and maybe I'm missing it, but I didn't really see kind of a, what's the plan of action for what we think needs to happen with cluster class to move it forward. So it's still experimental. And I think it's still, I don't know if it's alpha or beta, but yeah. I know this is kind of the way that we're recommending many people start to do managed cluster as well. So go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, so we don't have really a list of things that have to happen before we graduate. So the current state is basically we have a feature flag to disable it, and that's part of, I mean, the classical CRD and basically the half of the class CRD, which also implements it. They are part of our beta APIs, so they're not like alpha or something. But yeah, the whole thing is a feature, and it's disabled per default, and we call it experimental. That's all correct. So I think at this point, yeah, there's just no list of like, hey, we have to do those 5 things and then we graduate. What we are doing from our side, more like so Christian, Fabrizio, and me from our team, we basically just continuously improve it while we're getting feedback from our product people implementing it essentially. So that's just the part that we play in that story at the moment. On top of that, of course, also like community feedback here and there, smaller PRs, smaller issues. So basically just continuously improving, but I think there is no like big plan at the moment because nobody made it.
Okay.
Made that plan.
Okay. So yeah, I think there's the get out of experimental mode, and then there's, I mean, if it's already in beta, I think all of CAPI's in beta. I think that's another bigger issue, but I think just getting it out of experimental so people may feel more comfortable to utilize it would be a goal. Perhaps you're just maybe looking for someone to put something together to say, here's what maybe we need to graduate out of experimental with cluster class.
Yeah, the question is, how do we get to that list of things that we want to do before we graduated? Because yeah.
Yeah, I mean, going through I mean, there's a lot of issues already. Like if you just search cluster class in the issues, there's quite a few mentions of issues there for cluster class. So that's at least a starting place. But yeah, I feel like if there's never a list, then it's perpetual experimental, you know?
Yeah. I think what would make sense is, yeah, I would definitely like to hear Fabrizio's opinion on this essentially. What is his point of view? And probably we have to do some brainstorming on, like, let's say the people who are heavily involved on the implementation, but also the people who are using it, basically collecting like feedback from everyone, what they feel like, are there big things missing or not? Is everyone like mostly happy and we're just fixing minor stuff at this point? So my impression is someone who implemented a lot of it, and I mean, I think what you're probably missing a bit is maybe a bit more production experience in some parts. But I mean, usually I don't know what CAPI users are doing with it. I mean, that's one problem, in my opinion, of Cluster API, that we have a huge amount of users, but it's hard to get some sort of overview or like, is this all working fine? Is it fine if we don't get feedback? Is it fine if we only get minor issues? Who's even using which part of Cluster API? It's just so hard to guess, basically. So yeah, so yeah. I think like feedback about production usage is one important thing that would be nice to know. I mean, the only data point that I have is if people are opening issues or NPRs, and when we are seeing basically from our product side that they're rolling it out to customers and, you know, improving it over time there. That's my only data. Those are my only data points at this point. But I personally don't see like huge gaps. From my point, it's just minor stuff here and there. But we have minor stuff here and there everywhere in Cluster API, and I think that's just a normal part of development, I guess.
Okay. While being experimental, there at least we are rolling it out to production, so not only for dev environments. So yeah, Lubin.
Maybe. Sorry, one last thing. Maybe we just need to have a discussion, ping a few people, get their point of view, and then we can maybe graduate relatively soonish. Because I mean, what is the difference between now and then is probably that we're just committing to a bit more stability, but I don't know if there's even a difference because it's already a beta API, and just based on who's using the stuff already, it's not like we can just widely change our API or anything. That's not an option anyway.
Okay, so I mean, I could file an issue on graduating. At least there could be a discussion. There's some thoughts in there. Lumir?
I'm a big proponent of getting stuff out of experimental as fast as possible. The ecosystem is struggling a lot with features that stay in indefinite alpha. One example is the kubeproxy configuration. It has been in alpha for 10 years. I think from my perspective, which by the way, I don't work on the same product team as Fabrizio, Stefan, and Christian. I see a ton of usage in customer cases with Cosa class, and we have no feature requests at all. The feature just works the way it is. I think this is ready to go outside of experimental, unless the core team claims that they're blockers, they're breaking changes, which actually, by the way, it has been in production for so long that breaking changes we have to be really careful about them at this point. I think so. Big plus one for me to get this out of experimental. I can participate in discussions, give my production feedback because I have it, and let's get this going.
Yeah, Stefan.
Yeah, just one short note. There is already an issue about it. Has been open for a while. Maybe just write your take on that one, then it bubbles up in notifications, and then let's try to continue from there.
I think I pasted the right link into the notes, so feel free to take this off.
Yeah, there should be only one.
And, yeah, so it's just about enable cluster topology by default and remove feature gate. So I think that should be the right one. Yeah, which is also already around for some time. So yeah, let's maybe get together on that one and see how it goes.
Cool.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Stefan, you have the next one.
Yep. Can you open that link? And I just need 1 second to make an open. Okay. Yeah. Just I didn't really prepare this, or just spontaneous, like heads up sort of thing. Basically, we had a few reports over time downstream from customers, essentially, that they have they have trouble understanding like why node drains are not making progress. The current state is basically something like we send an event at some point, we write a bunch of stuff into logs, and we write very minimal information into conditions. That doesn't really surface as like, oh, drain didn't complete or something like that, but not really why. So I was looking a little bit more into what we're doing there exactly, and basically the situation is that we are using the drain help library from Kubernetes upstream, which is doing a bunch of really strange things, considering that we run this library in the middle of a controller. So on a very high level, it's basically querying the pods on a node. It filters out some pods that don't have to be evicted. Then it spawns one go routine for every pod that should be evicted, and then actively waits up until a timeout of 20 seconds for all of those pods to first, get eviction request out, and then for the pod to actually like vanish, terminate. But that usually takes some time. And then we retry 20 seconds later, and we repeat the same stuff. So we are really actively waiting a lot in our controllers, and I think that's not really great. So what I started doing is essentially first basically copying over the code of a drain helper and then just refactoring it almost from top to bottom. The main goal is basically to get this active wait out of there, then a bunch of code cleanup, because we probably need like half the code that is in there, because there's also like an entire branch for like, oh, what if eviction doesn't exist? Then let's do a pod delete, and eviction is supported since 1.22 in the V1 API. So there's like no reason to have like all this other code there. And also by refactoring this whole thing, we can just get a lot more information better out of it. Basically, we can write a condition which very clearly states, hey, this drain is not succeeded because those 5 pods are still in terminating. Those 2 pods cannot be evicted because this PDB has that many healthy pods, but it needs that many, and that's why I couldn't like evict this pod and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, at this point, just a heads up, I'm in the middle of implementing this. I would expect like next week until the CAPI meeting or something, it should be like in a state where it can be reviewed. But just if someone already has like huge concerns, feel free to bring it up also now. In general, I try to keep the behavior mostly the same. So we have stuff like, hey, if the node is unreachable, then don't really wait for pods to be deleted if they already have deletion times and that sort of stuff. Up until now, that all stays the same. It's just that I think from a behavior perspective, it's just that we don't actively wait in that controller, and we just requeue instead immediately. And of course, the changes that we get a lot better logs and a lot better conditions to surface what's going on.
Yeah, I think that bubbling up all that information in a good way is very helpful for operators on the management cluster to see why is my upgrade stuck and at this node and yeah, what's happening. Yeah, thanks for that work. Okay, I think then we can go to provider updates, but there's nothing there noted, so we can go to the feature group updates. Mike.
Yeah, just a quick update. We'll be having a meeting today, the Carpenter feature group. We're very close to having the kind of initial experimental version being contributed to Kubernetes SIGs. So yeah, we should have a brief discussion about that, and we'll probably talk about the future of the feature group as well, because I think we've reached a nice milestone, but now we have to figure out, do we want to keep the feature group going? How do we want to handle things next, etc. So yeah, if you're interested, please come.
Thanks, Mike. So I think with that, if there are no last minute agenda points, Stefan.
Just one small addition to what Mike said. Mike wrote a nice blog post. I don't know, maybe you want to link it here.
Yeah, I can add it to the agenda or something. Yeah. So Stefan is talking about, I wrote a blog post to describe kind of a retrospective on how we got to where we are. So talking about kind of how we arranged the feature group, how we designed things, and how we implemented the code. So I'll put it in the agenda here for anyone who might be interested. Thanks, Stefan.
Good call. So with that, I think we're done with the agenda and can get 10 minutes back for everyone. Thanks for taking part. And yeah, see you next week.